Welcome to Introduction to Ecology, Lesson 12. Now in the last class we talked about population growth, and specifically we focused on exponential and geometric growth. Both of those types of growth are represented in that figure that you see on the slide. Exponential growth is the blue curve because remember, exponential growth is defined over a continuous time interval. It's defined at any point in time. Now, geometric growth is represented by the red dots because geometric growth is only defined at discrete time intervals, typically at something like 1-year intervals. Regardless, both of these types of growth result in sort of a J shape to the points of the curve. So with exponential growth, we get a J-shaped growth curve, and you can see how that blue line looks like a J. And with geometric growth, we get what we call a J-shaped set of points. You can see how those red dots sort of trace out a J. Now, the last example we did in the last class, we talked about tribbles. And some of you may have picked up on the reference. So tribbles are actually a type of animal that only exists in Star Trek. And of course, Star Trek is science fiction. And I chose that example because exponential and geometric growth are kind of science fiction. They don't really occur in the real world. And that's because if you think back to lesson 1, one of our maxims was that no population can grow forever. But that's the assumption of exponential and geometric growth. Both of these models assume that the population can go up and up and up and up and up forever and ever and ever. And in reality, that doesn't happen. Now, exponential and geometric growth can be good approximations under certain conditions for real organisms, but at some point they break down. They don't describe real organisms forever under all conditions because all real organisms eventually have something that prevents them from growing up and up and up and up. Now, when we talk about things that prevent unrestrained population growth, we can divide them into two different types. The first is density-independent factors. So these are factors that cause birth, death, and dispersal to change sort of independent of population size or population density. So in other words, these things happen and they change these demographic rates, these birth rates, death rates, dispersal, but they don't do so based on how many organisms are there. So you can imagine here I might have a population of trees, and I start with one tree, and then the population doubles, and then it doubles again, and then it doubles again, and it keeps doubling until it's quite large, and then all of a sudden, a hurricane comes by and wipes out most of the population. Now, it's not like the hurricane was sitting there and saying, well, when the population gets to 20, I'm going to come down and I'm going to wipe all the trees out. It kind of just happened, and it didn't really matter how many trees were there, the hurricane hit. And so you can imagine we're down to one tree again, and it doubles, and then the population doubles, and the population doubles again, and it's not quite as big as it was the last time the hurricane came, but lo and behold, another hurricane goes by and wipes out most of the trees. So again, the hurricane went by in that small population, and it went by in that bigger population. It didn't matter the population size. The hurricane was going to hit when it was going to hit. And that's why it's density independent. It's independent of the density of trees. So again, we can have this tree population. It can start doubling again, do its best, grow, and now it's quite large again, and the hurricane comes and wipes it out. So again, that's an example of a density independent factor. Common density-independent factors are things like temperature and temperature extremes. So a really cold snap can wipe out tent caterpillars. We talked about that in one of the early lectures. It's not like the cold snap only happens when the caterpillar population reaches a certain density. The cold snap happens whether you have very few caterpillars or a whole lot of caterpillars. It doesn't matter. Precipitation, so floods and in particular droughts can be very devastating for plants. And again, they don't care how many plants are there. The drought happens when the drought happens. Same thing with catastrophic events. Floods, so that's sort of a catastrophic event, but also precipitation, hurricanes, fires, all of these things that can wipe out organisms, but they don't sort of wipe them out with any reference to how many organisms are in the population. So the other class of factors that can sort of limit population growth are what we term density-dependent factors. Now, these are factors that cause birth, death, and dispersal rates to change, but they do so as a function of the size or density of the population. So you can imagine I've got this tree growing in this park in the middle of a city. And the population of trees will double, and then it'll double again. And then at some point we reach a population size where there's just no more space left. There's no more room for new trees to grow. If they tried to grow up under this, they wouldn't get enough sunlight. And so instead of doubling, the population kind of gets squeezed and it doesn't grow as much as it normally would. And so we've altered the birth rate, we've lowered the birth rate, we've got less trees added per unit time to this population. But the reason we have is because the population's gotten too big to fit. And so the birth rate has declined as a function of the size of the population. Once the population gets too big, the birth rate starts to decline. So when the population growth rate declines as the population size gets bigger, we call this population regulation. So this is density-dependent factors that cause the population size to increase when the population is small, but then slow down and increase or even decrease when the population is big. And typically this is because of limited resources. In this case, the resource was just space or sunlight in the park between the city. In other cases, it might be some kind of prey that the animal's eating, or some kind of nesting site that the animal needs to reproduce. Anything like that will result in population regulation. Density-dependent factors don't always work in that way, though. Another type of density-dependent factor is what we call the Allee effect. So an Allee effect is a density-dependent factor that causes the population size to decrease when the population is very small, and to actually increase or grow faster when the population is big. And so you might think, well, how would that ever occur? Usually you think of resources being limited, and so that slows down the population growth at high densities. Well, an Allee effect frequently happens because of things like mating. So imagine I have this sort of very small population of butterflies, and they're kind of spread out over space. And they fly around looking for mates. And maybe this pair find each other and they mate, but this pair, they kind of drift around, and because the density of butterflies is so low, they spend their whole life searching for a mate and they never find one. Well, in that case, only that first pair of butterflies can breed, and so the population growth rate is only whatever those butterflies, make, maybe 4 babies. If I look at a bigger population, though, I have more butterflies per unit area, and so they're more likely to just randomly run into each other, and so now all of these butterflies can mate, and each of them can have 4 babies, and so we're growing at a faster per capita or per butterfly rate when we have more butterflies in the population. And so that's what we call an Allee effect. It's sort of the opposite of population regulation. So in graph form, here's the different things we've talked about. So when your population growth rate changes, but it does so sort of completely independent of population density, that is sort of a density independent growth rate. So you see the population growth rate is bouncing all over the place. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low, but there's no trend with population density. It's not like at high population density it's low and at low population density it's high. It's pretty much flat, although there's a lot of scatter. So that's density independent factors. If we take a look at density dependent, in the case where the population growth rate is smaller at high population densities and larger at low population densities, that's that example of population regulation. That's typically running out of resources. If we look at the other one where the line goes up so that we have low population growth rate at low population sizes or population density, but higher population growth rate when the population is big, that's again density dependent, but that's the Allee effect. That's typically something like finding a mate. All right, so frequently we try to modify our exponential growth or our geometric growth equations to include sort of these population regulation effects. And so when we have population regulation, instead of using an exponential growth equation, we actually use what's called a logistic growth equation. So this is a common form of density-dependent population growth. And with the logistic growth, the abundance increases rapidly at first, but then as the population gets too big, resources become limiting and the population reaches what we call a carrying capacity, the sort of maximum size of the population that that environment can sustain. Whether they run out of space, whether they run out of nitrogen, whether they run out of a prey, but basically the population growth rate slows down as the population gets closer and closer to this maximum population size that the environment can support. And so that maximum population size that the environment can support is what we call the carrying capacity. And in terms of calculus, in terms of a differential equation, logistic growth is the equation you see on the slide right there. And it looks quite a bit like that differential equation we saw for exponential growth, but it's sort of got an added term. And so again, we have the rate of change of the population size, just like we had before. We have the current population size. We have the per capita intrinsic rate of increase. And this is basically the population growth rate under optimal or low density conditions. And you can see that because when I have low density, when I have very small n, that term in the bracket, that n over k term, is going to be very, very small because n is very, very small. And so we can kind of ignore it. It's very small relative to 1. And so this basically just looks like the exponential growth rate equation. And so when we're looking at what that little r means, what that value is, it's basically how fast the population grows when the population is really small. It's sort of that exponential part of the growth before the population reaches sort of a bigger size and resources start to get limited. All right, and now that added term, that part that wasn't in the exponential growth equation, that's where we have the carrying capacity. And so what you'll notice is that as the population gets bigger, as n gets bigger, that last term, that n over k term, gets bigger and bigger. And so that whole term in brackets gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And what that means is that your population growth rate, that overall growth rate that the dn dt defines, that also gets smaller and smaller. The population growth rate slows as the population gets bigger. And what that basically means is that your population can't add as many new babies each year because, or each time unit, because there's just not enough resources to do that. All right, so that's a differential equation, and I promised in this course you will never have to integrate anything. You'll never have to use these differential equations. You will have to use the integral form. So if I integrate this, I actually get a solution, and this is something you do have to use. Now, I said in the last class you have to memorize the equation for exponential growth. You do not have to memorize the equation for logistic growth. I will give that to you on an exam. But you do have to know what all the terms mean. So we've already defined K, that's the carrying capacity. We've already defined little r, that's the intrinsic rate of population growth. T is time. So the new terms, we have n at t, which is the population size at time t. And then we have n at 0, which is the initial population size. All right, so there's our equation for logistic growth. And if we actually plot what that equation looks like as a function of time, if we just sort of put in different time points and plot the curve, you get something like that figure on the right-hand side, that blue line. And so the first point on that blue line is your initial population size. And then the population grows rapidly from there. It almost exhibits exponential growth for a while. And then the population gets big enough that things start to become limiting, and that growth rate levels off and the population size caps out. And that sort of value where the population size caps out, that maximum population size you see where the population sort of stabilizes at some set value, that's the carrying capacity. So on that graph, you should always be able to read off the initial population size and the carrying capacity. All right, so let's take a look at a closer up view. You can also sort of figure out a couple of other values. Well, mainly one other value. That initial slope, when you have a very, very low population density, in fact, when you have practically no individuals in the population, that initial slope of the curve, that is your intrinsic rate of increase. That's how fast the population grows when the population is really, 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 really small, and so resources are not limiting. Now, what you'll notice is the slope on that arrow is a lot steeper than the slope up a little further. So once the population gets big, that slope gets smaller, and so your rate of population growth gets smaller. Now, unlike exponential growth, where the sort of curve traced out what looked like a J, with logistic growth, we get what we call an S-shaped growth curve, and you can see how that sort of forms an S. It doesn't go up forever like a J, it eventually plateaus like an S. All right, so on an exam, I can ask you to solve what we call logistic growth problems. And we're going to work through a couple of examples in class because these can be a little bit tricky. So when we have a logistic growth problem, we're going to probably want to start by writing the logistic growth equation, and we're going to then try and figure out all the terms that we're given. So here's our logistic growth equation. Let me go back, sorry. We're going to be looking for the various terms in this equation. So the first thing we see, a population of 5 invasive moths were introduced onto a 10-acre island in 1980. Monitoring programs found that the population had doubled in size to 10 individuals by 1982. In the moth's native range, studies suggest that densities can reach about 200 per acre before food becomes limiting. Assuming that all of the island is good habitat for the moth, what will be the approximate size of the moth population in 1990? So first, how do we know that we want to use logistic growth? How do we know that we don't want to use exponential growth? Well, the first hint is that we've been told what the carrying capacity is. We say that the density can only get up to about 200 per acre before food becomes limiting, before the population caps out. And so the minute you see a carrying capacity, you know that you are not working with exponential growth. You know that you are not working with geometric growth. You have to be working with something like logistic growth, or what we'll see in a few slides, Beverton-Holt. So anytime you see carrying capacity, you rule out exponential growth, you rule out logistic growth. So we're going to write our logistic growth equation, and again, that's going to be given to us on the exam. And now we got to find the terms. Well, the carrying capacity, it says we have 200 moths per acre, and the whole island is 10 acres. So that means the carrying capacity for the whole island is 2,000 moths. You can go ahead and plug that in. Next, it says the population begins with 5 of these invasive moths in 1980. So the initial population size is 5. And then in going from 1980 to 1982, that takes us 2 years, and we end up with a total population of 10. So my n at 2 is 10, and the time that it takes to do that is 2. So I plug in 2 for t, and I plug in 10 for n at 2. Now what you'll notice is now I only have one missing value in that equation, and so I should be able to solve for it. And I will let you go ahead and try and solve for that. You should practice this. So if you're not good at isolating for variables, especially variables that are in exponents, you should practice that before the exam next week. And so again, we're going to try and isolate for r. If I do that, I find that r is 0.35. So my intrinsic rate of population growth is 0.35. Is that what the question's asking? No. The question is not actually asking what the intrinsic rate of growth is. It's actually asking, hey, what's going to be the population further on down the line? So this is what I term a two-step problem. It gives us some information first, and we can use that to find the intrinsic rate of growth, but we don't want to stop there. We want to use the intrinsic rate of growth to predict the population at a new time point. And that's a frequent way of asking these problems, is to give you some information, force you to calculate the population growth rate, and then use that growth rate to calculate the population size at a new time. What do? We go back to our logistic growth equation. We say, okay, well, we're going to start with the same 5 moths. We're going to have the same carrying capacity of 2,000 moths on the island. We now know that the population growth rate is 0.35, and then the question is we're trying to predict what the new population will be in 1990. So our total time is then from 1980 to 1990, and if I plug that in, that's 10 years, and I am now looking for the population 10 years later, and I can solve for it. That's 150. So I would then predict that there will be 150 moths on the island in 1990. And that's what the question's asking for. That's the answer you want to circle on the exam. And I promise you that it'll probably also have 0.35 on the exam for those of you who stop a little bit early. All right, so we're going to do a second example. This one's one that we're going to work out in class. So again, if you aren't in class, I would strongly suggest you work through this example. Make sure you know how to do it. If you don't know how to do it, borrow notes from another student, or again, come and talk to me. All right, so that is exponential growth and logistic growth. And like I said, exponential growth is really only true in science fiction. It's really only true for tribbles. But it's a good approximation when I'm looking at populations that are really, really small And so they're nowhere near where any of the resources that might be limiting are limiting. And you can see that if I plot the logistic growth curve and I plot the exponential growth curve, the exponentials in red and the logistics in blue, you'll notice that those curves are almost identical up until about 4 years. And then they start to deviate. So after 4 years, resources become limiting, and so the sort of true, real logistic curve starts to deviate from that idealized exponential curve that assumes the population can grow forever. All right. And then last class we had geometric growth, which we sort of saw were series of points that followed the exponential curve, right? Geometric growth was only defined at discrete time, but as long as we made our population growth rates equivalent, we got the same exact points on the geometric growth tracing out that exponential curve. And so you might wonder, well, if there's this discrete version of the exponential curve, shouldn't there be a discrete version of Beverton-Holt? Otherwise, what do you do for organisms that have these sort of pulsed breeding? Maybe they breed in May, but they also have a carrying capacity, right? We don't want to use a geometric equation for an organism with a carrying capacity, but we don't want to use a logistic equation for an organism that breeds once a year. And what do? Well, the good news is there is actually an equation that was developed to deal with discrete time population growth in a system or in a population that exhibits a carrying capacity. And that's what we call the Beverton-Holt equation. So that's what we're going to look at now. Here is the Beverton-Holt equation. And this is basically the discrete time equivalent to the logistic growth equation. So geometric growth is to exponential growth what Beverton-Holt is to logistic growth. Does that make sense? And exponential growth is to logistic growth what geometric growth is to Beverton-Holt. All right, so here is our Beverton-Holt equation. And again, you will not have to memorize this. I did say you need to memorize the geometric growth equation, but you do not need to memorize Beverton-Holt. I will give you this on an exam. You do, however, again, need to know what all the terms are. That I will not tell you. So this is our population at time t plus 1. This is our population at time t. So what this Beverton-Holt equation is going to do is it's going to take the population at year 1 and tell you the size of the population at year 2. Or it'll take the population size at year 2 and tell you the size of the population at year 3. Kind of like one of those versions of the geometric growth equation. That's exactly what it did. It took you from one year to the next year. All right. These are the growth rate per generation. So it's sort of how many new individuals are added in each year for each generation. You have one generation a year. Or sometimes, like I say, it might be more than 1 year. Periodic cicadas breed every 13 years, so your time period would not be a single year, it would be 13 years. There's your carrying capacity. So this is carrying capacity in the logistic growth equation. It's sort of how big can the population get before resources can become completely limiting, before no more individuals fit. It's the maximum size the population can get to. And that's your Beverton-Holt equation. So if you remember right, we had two versions of geometric growth, right? We had the version that take you from year 1 to year 2, and then year 2 to year 3, and year 3 to year 4. And then we said it would get kind of difficult, kind of tiring to figure out, the population size 100 years later, because you'd have to sort of do that calculation 100 times. And so with geometric growth, we had two forms of the equation. We had one form that took you from year 1 to year 2, and we had another form that took you from the first year all the way to some final time point. Same thing with Beverton-Holt. We have two versions of the equation, and I will give you both on the exam. So the first version we just saw takes you from 1 year to the next. The second version takes you from some initial year to some year 10 years later, 20 years later, 100 years later, 1,000 years later. All right, and I will not tell you on the test which is which, but I will give you both forms of the equation. So again, you want to use that red curve when you want to go from 1 year to the next, or from one breeding period to the next. Again, it might be more than a year if you got a periodic cicada or something. But you use that second equation to go from an initial time point to some later time point many years down the line. All right, so going back to this figure, in the red curve, we had the exponential growth. The green dots were sort of the discrete equivalent, and so that was our geometric growth. And then we said, well, look, exponential growth kind of matches logistic growth when the population is really small, but then logistic growth deviates. Not surprisingly, Beverton Holt is then the discrete points along the logistic growth curve. So again, geometric growth is to exponential growth what Beverton Holt is to logistic growth. And again, notice that Beverton Holt and geometric growth are very similar in the first couple of years when the population is really small, and then they start to deviate from each other. Beverton Holt, the yellow points, start to deviate from geometric growth, the green points, once the population gets to be a certain size, once it gets pretty big and resources become limiting. Same way that logistic growth starts to deviate from exponential growth once the population gets big. So again, logistic growth is to exponential growth what Beverton Holt is to geometric growth. All right. So again, we're going to do a Beverton Holt example. Again, this is one we're going to work out in class. So if you were not in class, make sure you know how to do it. Make sure you know how to isolate for the different variables because you will be asked to do that on the exam. Again, I'll give you the equation. I won't tell you which equation is which, but I will give you the equation, but you'll need to know how to manipulate it. You'll need to know what the different terms are and how to solve for them. And that can be a little tricky because you're taking not just square roots, but nth roots. So you need to know how to do that on your calculator. All right. So again, here we have logistic growth versus Beverton Holt. And we had a slide very similar to this when we were comparing geometric growth to exponential growth in the last class. So again, Beverton Holt, you use that for discrete time. Logistic growth, you use that for continuous time. So Beverton Holt, typically you use for organisms that reproduce all together in one big burst, in one big orgy. And you use logistic growth for organisms like humans that breed all the time. If I go in the hospital, on any day, there's probably going to be a few newborns. You don't just have newborns in May or in August or something like that. Humans reproduce all the time. Same with mosquitoes. Unfortunately, they just reproduce continuously. All right. Now, last class, we looked at the geometric growth equation and the exponential growth equation and said, hey, those look really similar. And as a result, we can sort of figure out how the two growth rates, how lambda and little r, are related. We can do the same kind of thing with logistic growth, except we have to sort of rearrange the equation a bit. And so if I rearrange that equation just a little bit, and again, I will give you both on the exam, what you'll notice is that I can compare my logistic growth to my Beverton Holt. And on the left-hand side of both, we have the number of individuals at time t. And then in the denominator, we have the initial number of individuals. In the numerator, we have the carrying capacity times the initial number of individuals. In the denominator, we have the carrying capacity minus the number of initial individuals. And this is pretty much the only place where these two equations differ. And again, what we can do then is we can say, well, r naught to the minus t has to be equal to e to the minus rt if we want to make our Beverton Holt equation match our logistic equation. So that's exactly what we do. We say e to the r has to equal r naught, or r has to equal the natural logarithm of r naught. And so again, I will not give you those relationships. I'll only give you the Beverton Holt and logistic equations. I will not give you the relationships relating little r to big R naught, just like I will not give you the equations relating lambda to little r. You'll have to be able to figure those out from the equations or memorize them. All right. But again, it's very similar. Those same sort of relationships were true with when I compared geometric and exponential growth. I had that lambda was equal to e to the r, and r was equal to the natural logarithm of lambda. So again, if I go back, that looks very similar. E to the r is equal to the r naught, and little r is equal to the natural logarithm of r naught. Same kind of deal here. Lambda is equal to e to the r, and r is equal to the natural logarithm of lambda. They're basically the same equation, and that is not coincidental. All right, so again, just like we saw, as long as we pick r and little r and that big R naught to be equivalent, then our Beverton Holt curve should trace out in dots exactly along the logistic curve. And so again, we should be able to use the logistic curve to predict the values of the Beverton Holt curve at the discrete time intervals. But again, the logistic curve is just defined over that entire time unit. I can say, well, what's the value of the population at 2.3 years, 2.4 years, I can do that using the logistic equation. I can't do that using the Beverage-Holt equation. The Beverage-Holt equation only tells me what the population is at year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. And again, those values should match what the logistic equation predicts for year 1, year 2, year 3, and year 4, provided that the relationship between little r and big R naught are the same. All right, so now we're going to look at human population growth. And so, we might think, well, human populations have been growing pretty quickly. Maybe they're exhibiting exponential growth. And so what I can do is I can actually predict what the exponential growth rate would be based on the number of humans at some time point and the number of initial humans at some time point earlier. And so I can use that equation there. That's basically just me rearranging the exponential growth rate equation, which you do have to memorize, and solving for the exponential growth rate. Now here's the interesting thing. If I look at the human population growth rate and I predict the exponential growth rate going from year 1 to year 800, way back in history, I find an exponential growth rate of 0.0032. But if I look at it going from year 1 to year 1550, I actually find a different exponential growth rate. And it gets even worse because if I look at the growth rate between year 800 and year 1550, I get a totally different answer again. Now if I look at the growth rate from year 1 to 1930, a different number again. And again, if I look at sort of a shorter time period, I get a fifth number. And so I can keep doing this. I can keep looking at the exponential growth rate of the human population over different time periods, and I keep predicting different exponential growth rates, depending on the time period I look at. And so the question is, what's going on? Why is the human population growth rate keep changing depending on the time period I look at? Well, the answer is because the human population growth rate has actually changed over time. So we have not grown at a constant rate. We have not doubled in size at predictable time intervals, sort of at that constant time period for doubling. So we actually had a really quick increase in growth between 1930 and 1950. These are sort of your baby boomers. We then had a massive decline in the population growth rate for a number of reasons. There were some natural disasters. There was social upheaval in China where there was initially a lot of growth going on, and that caused a pretty big dip in our growth rate in the 1950s. And then pretty much ever since then, the human population growth rate has been dropping. It's been dropping for almost 100 years. So that's interesting, and that explains why we don't predict a constant exponential growth rate for the human population over all of time. In fact, the growth rate hasn't been constant over all the time. It's been changing all over the point. And so it depends on what time interval you use, what you'll calculate for your exponential growth rate, because the exponential growth rate equation assumes a constant growth rate, and that's not what's happened in the human population. Now, I said it's interesting that the human population growth rate has been sort of declining or slowing for 100 years. Because if we think back to sort of what we talked about at the beginning of the class, we said, well, with logistic growth, the population growth rate slows as the population gets closer to its carrying capacity. And so the fact that human population growth has been declining for about 100 years leads us to ask the question, has the human population reached its carrying capacity? Is it slowing down because we're sort of reaching the limit of the number of people that we can fit on the planet? And in that case, rather than exhibiting a J-shaped growth curve, humans are actually beginning to plateau out and make a growth curve that looks like an S. And so if that's true, then we can actually take that S shape and extrapolate it and figure out how big we think the human population will get before it stops growing. And so depending on the estimates you get, people predict that we'll have about 9.6 billion people by 2050, and it'll just grow a little bit more. It seems like a lot, but it's still just a little bit. Be about 10 billion by 2080. And so that's sort of the size that people are predicting the human population is going to get to before we stop growing, before we say, hey, that's all the people we can fit. That's all the resources the world has. So can we fit 10 billion? That's a great question. And actually, the answer to that question depends on how many resources each human uses. So if we look at what the average US person uses, or at least what they used in 2007, probably that's less than what they're using now even, Most scientists predict that the Earth can support about 1.5 billion people. So 10 billion, we're already way above carrying capacity. And 10 billion, there's no way we could fit that many people. There's no way we can fit 10 billion people using resources at the rate that you and I are reusing resources. But if we look at resource use by humans in other countries, say in India, people in India use a lot less resources per person. They use a lot less energy per person, less food, particularly in food waste per person. And so the Earth could actually support more than 10 billion, more than where it seems to be leveling out. The Earth would probably support 13 billion. And so the answer to whether we are reaching the human carrying capacity and exactly what the human carrying capacity is really depends on our behavior. And it depends on you and I, and it depends on what we do, whether we can fit more people on this earth or whether we're already way too many people for the number, for sort of the resources that the earth has. All right, so that's our talk about logistic and Beveridge-Holt growth. Again, these are equations you use when you have a population that is sort of getting bigger and reaching the point where resources are becoming limiting and the population growth rate is slowing accordingly. So that's where that differs from the last class where we talked about exponential and geometric growth where there is no limit to the growth of population size. Again, if you have any questions, if you want to talk about these problems, send me an email and I will try and help you work through it because I do realize that these are math equations and so some of you find them very difficult. Other than that, I will see you next class.